What were the provisions of the Treaty of Paris which ended the Revolutionary War? First of all, King George III said, fine, you want to be independent, you are no longer a part of Great Britain, you are independent. Secondly, the boundaries would be west to the Mississippi River and south to Spanish Florida. This was extremely magnanimous of the English. We were the 13 colonies. Yes, we'd begun to spread out into this new territory, but then remember, this had all been given to the Quebec colony, extended down to the Ohio River. Suddenly now, we are given this whole vast new territory from the Mississippi down. Spanish Florida, it had briefly, remember, gone to England. After the 7 Years' War, it is now back under Spanish control, so they have no ability to control anything about Florida. Had we really fought, was this our birthright to all this huge new territory, an area that would double the size of the 13 colonies? In my opinion, no. We had not done adequate fighting in the 7 Years' War to acquire this. So this is a real boost to the colonies that we were able to get all of this territory. Third, the colonists would have fishing rights in Canadian waters, so we could continue to fish up here in the cold Canadian waters. Both the U.S. and England would have free shipping rights on the Mississippi River. So we could bring our goods. There were no roads hardly at all back then. And so the way you got your produce to market was you put it on a boat, flat bottom barge, something, got it to a river such as the Ohio River. Wherever you were, you would get your goods to a river, float it down to the port of New Orleans. From there, it would go to wherever in the world. So the Canadians could get their goods to the Mississippi and down, meaning England, and we could. So both England and the U.S. have free shipping rights on the Mississippi River. Fifth, pre-war debts would be honored. Colonists owed large sums of money to British merchants. For years, we had been buying from British merchants. Well, then we were boycotting and doing all that too. But there were huge debts owed by merchants along the coast to British shippers, British merchants. And for years, these debts had gone unpaid. And of course, during the war, they went unpaid. Pre-war debts would be honored. This was owed to the merchants, not per se to the British government. And sixth, Congress was to recommend to the states to give back seized Loyalist property. During this 4-year Revolutionary War time frame, in areas that the Loyalists were stronger, the Patriots oftentimes suffered devastation. In areas where the Patriots were stronger, the Loyalists sometimes suffered devastation. And lands had been taken, properties, houses had been taken by the Patriots from Loyalists. They were doing what they were supposed to do. God save the king. Now, should those people have suffered for this, for being loyal? And so it was Congress's job to recommend to the various states Loyalist properties that were seized must be given back or compensated for in some way. When it is merely a recommendation and not a demand, it would be interesting to know if anyone ever did a study to find out how much of the properties were ever returned to the Loyalists. Thus ends the Treaty of Paris. If you had been living in the colonial time period, if you were a white male, therefore having a right to have a voice. Do you think you would have been a loyalist or a patriot or completely indifferent? In class, I would take a vote on this, but since we are not in class, I will just let you ponder the issue. And our first government will be the Articles of Confederation. And it is a total of 9 pages. I just have the front page to show you here. Shortly before declaring independence in 1776, the Congress appointed a committee to draft a written constitution for the new nation. So before we declare independence, we got to have the government, because if we're no longer British subjects, because we've declared independence, even though we haven't won the fighting yet, we need to have our own government created. So we create our own government. The finished product was the Articles of Confederation. It was adopted by Congress in 1777. In due course, the new Constitution was sent out to the states for their approval, but final action was delayed for 4 years. Unanimous approval of the Articles of Confederation by the 13 states was required. One of the things we will soon learn do not work very well when you must always have everyone's agreement. Maryland stubbornly held out until March 1st of 1781, less than 8 months before the decisive victory at Yorktown. So we had operated almost the entire war under the Continental Congress with no official government set up. But now 8 months before we win, we finally get Maryland to sign, and the Articles of Confusion, as many called them, were finally adopted. And here is the signatory page at the end. You have your various colonies listed. Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, no, that's a name. But anyway, here we have our various signatures. And once again, dun, 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 who has the largest signature on this document? For the state of Massachusetts, it is John Hancock. John Hanson for Maryland. Up here is John Hanson. You can just barely read it. John Hanson. Samuel Adams signs for Massachusetts. And here is Samuel Adams. Roger Sherman of Connecticut and Robert Morris of Pennsylvania once again signed all 3 documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. Now, this time, we got Samuel Adams, but I do not think we have John Adams on this one. Just the one cousin was there to create this document. The Articles of Confusion or Confederation was a loose confederation or a firm league of friendship. 13 independent states were to be thus linked together for joint action in dealing with common problems, such as foreign affairs. A clumsy Congress was to be the chief agency of government. There was no executive branch. We had no president. King George III had left a bad taste in our mouth, and so we didn't want even a king of our own ruling us. No king, no executive. Most Americans felt their state was more important than the Union. They were Virginians first. They were Massachusettsians first. They were Americans second. So Is this a strong document? Absolutely not. We were tired of strong government of England over us. And so our state matters first. We are a grouping, a league of friendship here for better organization. The new central government was bound to be weak and crippled. Well, what could this government do? First of all, it was composed of delegates from each state, and each state had one vote. Now, I see good things to this, and I see bad things to this. If I was a large state, I wouldn't like this. Why should my 100,000 people count the same as your 50,000 people? One state, one vote. But if I was a small state, I would like this because I would not be railroaded and outvoted in everything by the big states. So one state, one vote. Secondly, Congress would decide war and peace and appoint Army and Navy officers. Yes, as an independent nation, you need that. Third, it could send and receive ambassadors. Absolutely, you have to. Fourth, it could enter into treaties with foreign powers. Yes. Fifth, it could operate a post office and post roads. If you think the post office is ever going to disappear from the American landscape, I have a feeling not. It was in the Articles of Confederation. It is in the U.S. Constitution. It would take a constitutional change to get rid of the post office, post offices and post roads. The government had to have a way of securely sending messages around the country. And so if you want to ensure that your message, your letter gets from point A to point B, you have to operate post offices and post roads. Very little roads back then, post roads. And so the government had that ability from the get-go. Coin money, number 6. We're no longer British. We don't want King George III on our money. 7th, had the power to tax, no power to tax, but could ask for money from the states. Do you see this as being a problem? The federal government needs to run, but it cannot tax. It has to ask the states for money, who feel that the state is more important than the federal government. So how much money are they going to want to dish over to the federal government versus keeping for their state government? This is a real problem. And 8, they have the right to fix weights and measures and regulate Indian affairs. So many of the things that a normal government would be able to do. Well, there were great problems with this government. First of all, they could not coerce the states to do anything. Yes, they had the right to raise armies and navies, but did they have any? No. So they had no power to force the states to do anything. Secondly, they were only a legislative body, and it took 9 out of 13 votes to approve anything. So their first mistake was when they said all 13 colonies had to sign the Articles of Confederation till it could go into effect. That took 4 years. And everything had to pass by a 3/4 vote. 9 out of 13 had to agree to it. If you're familiar with cooking and different measuring cups, I tried to get a picture of the different sized measuring cups and I couldn't get it. So we'll do it all with 1 cup here. You got 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, 2/3, and 3/4, and the whole. 3/4, 9 out of every 13 had to sign for any law to be accepted and passed. We will learn from this when we put together our current Constitution. We will not require 3/4. You're never hardly going to get 3/4. If we took a vote and said, hey, after class, we're all going to go out to lunch, Let's see where we want to go. Some people are going to say, oh, I want McDonald's. It's got to be fast because I got to get to my job. Another group of people would say, oh, no, I want to sit down and relax. I want to sit down, a restaurant that we go to. And some of the people would say, I never ate breakfast. Let's go to a breakfast place. And then someone would say, I got to get to work right away, or I got another class. I can't go at all. How are we ever going to get 3/4 of the class to the same restaurant to have lunch after class? Well, same thing with Congress, getting 3/4 to agree. When we create our Constitution, to pass a law, it only has to be 50% or 51%. So basically half have to agree for it to go into law. If they sign the bill and the president vetoes it, it goes back to Congress, and Congress has to override the veto. We still said, even in overriding a veto, 3/4 is too much. All you have to get is 2/3, which is less than 3/4. We realize this is almost an unattainable goal. But if you can get 2/3 of the Congress to agree to the same thing, the nation is pretty set on that agenda. So 3/4, that was a great weakness. Congress established a tax quota for each of the states and then asked them to please contribute their share on a voluntary basis. So Virginia has more people than Rhode Island, so we're going to ask Virginia to pay more taxes than Rhode Island. But once again, asking on a voluntary basis. The central authority was lucky if in any given year it received 1/4 of its requests. How is a government going to operate in the deficit when they never can get enough money to run the show? The feeble national government in Philadelphia. We had started out with our government in New York. Now we're down to Philadelphia. There will be a total of 3 national capitals we will have in U.S. history. This sounds like a good test question. New York, Philadelphia, and then finally we will get to it under Washington's administration. We will decide that the District of Columbia will be our final government capital. But at this point we were in Philadelphia. The government could advise, could recommend and request, but in dealing with the independent states, it could not command or coerce or enforce. Once again, we don't have a standing army. We don't have a standing navy. We had the right to create them. It could not act directly upon an individual citizen of a sovereign state. The new Congress, with all of its paper powers, was even less effective than the old Continental Congress, with no constitutional power whatsoever. Yet the Articles of Confederation, weak though they were, proved to be a landmark in government. The terms of the congressman was only 1-year terms, and we would learn from this. This caused for great difficulty. You no sooner got yourself down to Philadelphia and started to figure out what is going on in government and what your role is now that you've been elected to this position, when, hey, I'm halfway through my term. I now have to start campaigning to get reelected to another term. And so you would constantly have newbies showing up because those that didn't win reelection, and the time it took to then be campaigning instead of doing what you're supposed to be doing, we soon found that 1-year terms were just not in the best interest. Also, everything was done by committees. Well, we know committees take a long time to operate. Congress got the blame and the responsibility, but none of the power. Now, my question to you is, who was the first president of the United States in Congress assembled? Who is the President of the United States in Congress assembled? I know you're all going to think, oh, George Washington. No, that was not our first government. And I said the President of the United States in Congress assembled. He was the head of the President. He was the head of the Assembly. He was Congress. He was not President as executive, as a separate office. And this will be John Hanson. When he signed the Articles of Confederation for the state of Maryland, remember the last state to finally agree, he was immediately elected President of the United States in Congress assembled. So that sounds also like a very good test question. Who was the first President of the United States in Congress assembled? There were international problems now that we were a new independent nation. Problems with England because English troops still were out west. We were angry at that. You gave us all that western territory. Why are your troops still there? And they said, well, the U.S. had not paid back its debt to British merchants, so why should we get out of the West? Problems also flared up with Spain over Florida and New Orleans. Even France, our ally, had cooled off. She immediately demanded repayment of money loaned during the war. She was miffed. We undermined her at the treaty. All right, fine, you're going to act that way? Pay us back now. Not later, now. Also, pirates of the North African states were ravaging America's Mediterranean commerce and enslaving Yankee sailors. And we'll come to that more with the Jefferson administration. At home, things were not much better. Shays' Rebellion had flared up in western Massachusetts in 1786, threatening the government. Some government officials had to run to Princeton University for safety against Shays' Rebellion. This is embarrassing. Congress people running for their lives. We were obviously internally and internationally in a state of chaos. There was an obvious crying need for a stronger central government. Alexander Hamilton. And here we have Alexander Hamilton talking with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison here. This is the center of a larger painting. But Alexander Hamilton calls for a new conference to be held in May of 1787 in Philadelphia. This is the new national capital. He says, we got to talk. There are problems with this government. We need to address it. We need to make some changes. All the states agreed to participate in the convention except for Rhode Island. They said, we are having none of this. And this will be the Constitutional Convention of May of 1787. What ultimately will happen is they will say, we can't even revise and work with this document, the Articles of Confederation. We're going to completely chuck it and create a new government. There were 55 delegates ranging in age from 26 to 81. And the eldest, that 81-year-old, will be Benjamin Franklin. The delegates were mostly upper class, city dwellers, lawyers, merchants, and planters. The common man did not come to this meeting. These were individuals who were rich enough that could take the whole summer to go discuss government. So these were your plantation owners who were wealthy. These were your shopkeepers who had huge businesses. These were the upper class. They were all well-educated, well-to-do, capable individuals. The common man is not here. This is the aristocracy. I need to mention that to you over and over. Who created our Constitution, our current government? The aristocracy. James Madison of Virginia. He lectured the delegates on forms of government. And here we have James Madison lecturing the 55 delegates. Here, a picture of James Madison. He came to Philadelphia with stacks and stacks of books. And he, at the beginning of the conference, went from book to book to book, and he lectured the delegates. This is how the Romans did it, and this was the good things, and this was the bad things. This is how the Egyptians did it, and this is the good things, and this is the bad things. This is how the Greeks did it. So he is lecturing them on government before they even begin. He has thus been given the title Father of the Constitution because of his active involvement in this document. He not only lectured the delegates, but the entire time that the conference is going on, he is sitting there at his desk and he is madly writing. And he said this, and he replied with this, and then this person said this, and then that person said that. How do we know all the arguings and what happened at this Continental Convention behind closed doors if it weren't for these copious notes that James Madison took and left for posterity? So he truly is the father of the Constitution. When the convention began, the Virginians already had a plan in the Virginia resolution. So they came to the table saying, this is how we would like the government put together. We have thought this out ourselves. This would serve as a basis for guiding the discussion. Their program called for a national executive, which we now have, a judicial system, which we now have, and a bicameral legislature, which we now have. In some ways, this is very similar to England, but also very different than England. They have a king, we have a president, an executive, but very different. They're not hereditarian for life. We have a judicial system. We have local, state, and federal judicial system. And before we just had one legislature, one Congress under the Articles, now we'll have a bicameral House. Bicameral means two sections, two House legislature. And in this bicameral system, each state would be would receive their representation based on population. So, in the House, population, Virginia's the largest state. She would have the most representatives in the House. In the Senate, Virginia had the largest population. She would have the most representatives in the Senate. So the big states would have clout. Now, this is a good thing because if you have more people, you should have more say. But the little states are going, no, this is not going to be fair. Pretty soon we're going to be outvoted at every turn in the road. And so Mr. Patterson of New Jersey had come up with an alternative plan. Under the Articles, we had been one state, one vote. The little states got the same as the big states. And he said, fine, we will have a bicameral system, but it will be equal representation in both the House and in the Senate. Even in our Congress, it is similar. England has a judiciary. England has a legislature. They have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Well, we have the Senate and the House. The House of Commons would somewhat compare to our House of Representatives, and the House of Lords would somewhat compare to our Senate. it's not quite that simple, but it's the easiest way to sort of make a similarity. But there are many differences between Parliament and the American Congress. Well, you got to come up with a compromise. The compromise that is finally reached is in the Senate, there will be equality, equal representation, big states and little states. But in the House of Representatives, that would be based on population. And so Virginia would have more than Delaware, the smallest state, would have. And that was an agreeable compromise for all. Delegates were opposed to unrestrained democracy. This was the aristocracy that was convening, not the common man. Well, what about slavery? This problem of counting the slaves for representation and taxation. All right, you southern states, they said, we want to count the slaves because then we have a bigger population and can get more representatives in the House. And the North says, okay, fine. But then when we divvy up taxes, you states with the more population, you're going to have more taxes. We're not paying huge taxes on all those slaves. Are you out of your mind? And so the final resolution would have to be determined by compromise. The southern states would have absolutely nothing to do with this new constitution if we in any way, shape, or form touched their slavery issue. The final compromise that was reached was that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person. 3/5 meaning for every 5 you get to count 3 as people for your representation in the South. But at the same time, for every 5, you only have to pay taxation based upon 3. The Constitution did not interfere in the slave trade until 1808. They said they did. That was one of the few things mentioned about slavery in the Constitution. That in the year 1808, the new importation of slaves would end. So, what is mentioned with regard to slaves in the Constitution? The 3/5 compromise, every 5 slaves count as 3, and the new importation would end in 1808. The institution itself, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Will it eventually end? Will we... No, too hot to handle. Never discussed amongst the delegates, because had they have gotten into that discussion, the southern delegates whose way of life was squarely on the backs of slave labor would have walked out of the convention. So as an institution, it was never addressed. Well, now we got to ratify it. Over the following months, the meetings of this constitutional convention was held in the sweltering heat behind closed doors with absolutely no press coverage. Oh, this would never be allowed today. The American public needs to know. Well, they said we need to be able in Independence Hall here to discuss what we are going to do, our form of government. So, buildings back then used to be designed where you had windows on each side to allow for cross ventilation, get a breeze through the place. Well, they got closed doors, they got closed windows. They don't want people standing outside the window hearing what they're saying, because when it was time for lunch, when it was time for supper, when they went to their Motel 6, they did not want the delegates to be harangued by the population. What are you doing about this? What are you doing about that? Well, what about this? They wanted in privacy to work out these issues. And once they had worked it out completely, then they would present to the nation. This is our conclusion. This is our new government. Accept or refuse. And so, completely behind closed doors. Therefore, the only way we know what happened is what I mentioned previously to you. James Madison was writing notes and notes and notes. And now we know all the arguments that took place and who said what and etc. because of what he had taken down. The meetings were chaired by George Washington, as he was a very respected individual. He had taken us through the Revolutionary War, come out victorious, and so he would, okay, your time's done, sit down. Okay, now you can talk. He chaired the meetings. It was said he only spoke once. He felt that as chair of the meetings, he should not have an opinion to sway the arguments that were going on. He just sat up there and kept the peace. The final version was signed on September 17th, 1787. 42 stuck it out to the end, but 3 of them were not signing that document, so it only ended up being signed by 39. So 55 started, 42 stayed to the end, and 39 signed. On September 28, 1787, the document was submitted to the Congress, and they then submitted it to the individual states for their ratification. State conventions were then held in each state, and the people in the states then chose delegates who were sent to the convention to vote whether to ratify the Constitution or not. This was actually a very democratic move. Once again, is the common man Joe and Fred at casting a vote as to whether to ratify this or not? No, I don't know that Joe and Fred Farmer and Hillbilly and Dirt Farmer could even read and write, let alone discern the fine differences in government. That was for the learned. And so the way that the common man was represented is, let's say it were Texas. Houston gets to send a representative to Austin to vote, shall we ratify or not? And El Paso sends a representative to Austin. And Dallas sends a representative to Austin. So we in Houston say, Joe Schmo, we all like Joe Schmo, and Joe Schmo lives here and he knows what's best for us. Let's send Joe Schmo to represent us. So, are all of the Houstonians represented? Yes, indirectly, because we chose Joe Schmo. So there is going to be conventions held in the 13 states, and they will individually decide, shall we ratify or not? Some people were very against this new Constitution, because this new Constitution was very different than the Articles. Alexander Hamilton said, what we have is too weak. We need something stronger. And is this government stronger? You betcha it is stronger. Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution. And the Constitution begins with a long run-on sentence as its first paragraph, the preamble as it's known, the preamble to the Constitution. And many of you may have in government or U.S. history in your high school or even in middle school memorized the preamble, this one long run-on sentence. For test number 2, if you show up and on a blank piece of paper, if you write for me the preamble to the Constitution, I will give you 5 extra points. So here, you already know in advance, start learning the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Talk about long run-on sentence. In the olden days, they liked lots of commas and semicolons, and they could sure write them long sentences. This is the preamble. So, why are we doing this? To form a more perfect union, because the articles hadn't been perfect. To ensure all of these items that needed to be addressed. And, of course, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. I have had so many people write for me the preamble and write prosperity. No, prosperity is very different than posterity. Possibly none of you in the class have posterity. Maybe 1 or 2 of you do. But all of your parents have posterity. Your posterity is your offspring. I have 3 posterities, 3 children. So we want the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our offspring, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, all the way down. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And once again, there's that preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. That's first little sentence. Then Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, etc. The final signatory page when we are done. George G. Washington. He is the first to sign up here. Excuse me. And he signs under the bottom of the document, not with the delegates for Virginia. As the chair of the meetings the whole summer long, he signed first. Then we've got Delaware's delegates, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, etc., Pennsylvania, everyone signing. James Madison, father of the Constitution, he's from Virginia. Alexander Hamilton, he is from New York. Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania. Charles Pinckney signs for South Carolina. And here we have South Carolina. Now, we've got 2 Pinckneys here. We've got a Charles Pinckney and we've got a We've got a Charles Pinckney and a Charles Pinckney. We've got 2 Pinckneys. So which of these is the Pinckney that will then be a presidential candidate? He does not win in 1804 or 1808, I am not sure. We also have a Pinckney that's very involved with negotiations over Florida. So which one of those it is, I am not sure. And of course, as I said, this is the last of the 3 big documents. Roger Sherman and Robert Morris sign for their respective states, Connecticut and Pennsylvania. The Constitution is, if you look at the back of your book, a very short document. And to think that for 200 years we have operated under a document as short as that is actually quite phenomenal. Some countries have constitutions that are the size of small books. Well, the reason is we don't have to we don't have to check off our Constitution every time we make a change, because we have a system where we can make amendments, changes to our Constitution. And our amendments is almost, not quite, I'm exaggerating, but it is probably a quarter as long as our Constitution is. Also, with a system of state governments and federal governments, a lot of things can be delegated to the states without having to be written into the Constitution. So there's a lot of flexibility in our Constitution that with time, laws will determine how things are to be interpreted. Well, the Anti-Federalists were very against this Constitution because they feared that a centralized government would be a threat to personal freedoms. You could pretty much do as you pleased under the Articles. The federal government could not act against any individual in a state. Only the state could act against. Oh, no, not now. This is a strong Constitution. Secondly, there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution guaranteeing traditional liberties. As Englishmen, we always had the right to this, to that, to the other. Well, no, we're no longer Englishmen. Nobody had put many of our traditional English rights into this Constitution. Right to trial by jury, right to innocent until proven guilty. And so it was agreed by James Madison. We understand it's not in there now, but if you will sign on the dotted line in our first meeting once we convene under the new government, we will create a Bill of Rights. We will address these issues, and we will come to that shortly. Good to his word, he does do that. Third, they felt state sovereignty would be destroyed by a strong central government. Remember, my state will do for me what's necessary, not my federal government. Well, now if you have this strong federal government, it's going to weaken my state government. Fourth, the president might become like a king. He had too much power in his hands as the chief executive. Fifth, we were now going to be able to enforce under the Articles of Confederation. Some government officials had run for their lives. We will now have a standing national army, and many saw this as a threat to liberty. Sixth, they said only the rich and well-born can afford to hold office. We would soon become a government only of the aristocracy. And seventh, people would be financially ruined if taxed by both the state and the national government. State government needs its money. Federal government needs its money. Man, now we're going to be taxed by two institutions. Remember before, the federal government was lucky to get a quarter of its tax it requested per year. Well, now this new government can enforce its taxing. The ratification process began rather smoothly. Oh, sorry, I did not show you this. Here, George Washington looking over as the delegates sign the Constitution. Ratification begins rather smoothly. From December 7th, remember in September it was sent out to the states. So we've got October, November, and by December 7th, a little over 2 months later, states are beginning to make their decisions. From December 7th to January 9th, within that 1 month time period of 1788, 5 states ratified the Constitution. We needed all 13 under the Articles of Confederation. We learned our lesson. Now we're still requiring 3/4. We're requiring 9 of the states to ratify before the Constitution could go into effect. But none of this all. Delaware. They are the first state coin to have come out. On their license plate, it says the first state. Why? Because they, of all the states, were the first to ratify. And they are the smallest in population. Yes, in rank, they are 13th. Even Rhode Island has more people by 10,000 than did Delaware. And Georgia, who was the last colony, comes in at 82, even more than Rhode Island. So, Delaware, the first state. Second, Pennsylvania. Physical violence took place in Pennsylvania over ratification, but it eventually passes by a 2-1 vote. Physical violence? Oh, I forgot to show you here. Yes, Caesar Rodney on his galloping horse for the state of Delaware, the first state, license plate, the first state. Then Pennsylvania is number 2. New Jersey, 3rd. 4th is Georgia. Georgia unanimously accepts it. 5th is Connecticut. They approved, but with resistance also. 6th is Massachusetts. Some very popular people were against it in Massachusetts. It eventually passes by 1 vote. Ooh, the slimmest of margins. And here John Hancock proposed a Bill of Rights when Massachusetts delegates met in Boston to ratify the Constitution. Later states had the presumption that this would be the first item of business, which it was. 7th was Maryland, and it passed rather quickly. 8th was South Carolina. They passed easily also. 9th was New Hampshire, and it was narrowly ratified there in June of 1788. 9 out of the 13, the Constitution could now technically go into effect, but they decided, you know what? Some very key states have not yet had their conventions. The most populous, which is Virginia, and 5th populous, which is New York, had not had their convention and dealt with the issues. So it was decided, you know what? We are going to hold off, even though we could go into effect, until Virginia and New York have voted, ratified. Virginia said, we will not ratify without a Bill of Rights. So we keep hearing this issue, Bill of Rights, Bill of Rights. Secondly, they said, if we agree, once again, we are the largest state. We are the most populous state. If we agree to this, we want our boy as first president. We want George Washington to serve as the first president. You know, this would be interesting. I have no idea if they asked him before they stated this. We're going to make him our first president. I would hope he would have agreed to this. Meanwhile, Patrick Henry, very big person in colonial and this time period during the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, all of that, Sons of Liberty, and the Revolutionary War. He is one of our founding fathers. Patrick Henry was very against this new Constitution, and he is supposed to have said, I smell a rat in Pennsylvania, which is where the discussions of this all took place. New York's convention finally decided on ratification. Much of their decision was based on the writings of the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a series of 85 essays written to the public with the hopes of influencing the Constitutional Convention's delegates. They were authored by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. The intent was, we can't harangue the delegates personally, but we can write these articles to the public and during breaks, during lunch, during evening hours. The delegates have nothing to do. They're going to pick up the newspaper and read what's in the newspaper. Before they are sent to the convention, they're going to be reading the newspapers. We're going to print these articles in the newspapers saying this is why this new constitution is necessary. And you're going to read these articles and vote yes. Alexander Hamilton had called for the meeting in the first place. Does he want a stronger constitution? Yes. The father of the Constitution, and John Jay. We have seen him as part of the delegation to work out the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. I told you to see him again. We will see him again yet more. So these three write the Federalist Papers. John Jay was a New York lawyer. And Madison was 36 years old at the time. He would later become president of this new nation. Alexander Hamilton was only 32, and he authored the most of the articles. New York finally agreed at the new Constitutional Congress's first meeting. They accept ratification. And immediately what happens? James Madison introduces the first 12 amendments to the Constitution. Yes, you heard me right. The Bill of Rights. When the convention finally meets, remember they said we're going to wait until New York and Virginia hold their ratification. Virginia ratified, now New York is ratified, and they're meeting for their first meetings. The Bill of Rights. And this is this is the Bill of Rights. And, there is some exciting things about this Bill of Rights that we need to cover. But we have run out of time, and so we are stopping for this lecture.